Irish Nation, welcome to the show. We are here to talk about Notre Dame football, moving on from the first round of the college football playoff, a historic game in South Bend, Indiana, that Mike and I were fortunate enough to be a part of as the Irish advanced to the Sugar Bowl on New Year's Day in New Orleans. And Mike, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, all of that good stuff. But for our listeners, we have a new holiday, and it's the first round of the college football playoff, and it's celebrated in South Bend, Indiana. And honestly, that was my Christmas, and it was awesome hanging out with you. It was awesome being together with friends and family. Let's skip this whole Christmas noise. Let's get to what matters. How was your game day experience? Describe the crowd, the environment. What was it like for you being back on campus for this just huge matchup?
It was incredible, and you were literally right next to me during the game, so you had the exact same experience I did. I was blown
I don't know. I
away.
was shirtless in the fourth quarter. That was a little bit of a different experience. That was a little bit of a tougher football environment.
Brett and a few other guys we were sitting with, they went all in on the shirtless approach, which honestly matches if you look at Midwestern playoff football in the NFL. I would say that is a staple of what you tend to see in opposing, in the audiences. So I feel like we brought a little bit of that, which was fun. Brett was unable to talk me into taking my shirt off, which I think worked out because you and Jim and a couple other guys, you guys got really nasty colds. I still got a cold, but it wasn't quite as bad as what I think you guys had. But yeah, I mean, that atmosphere was unreal. I think it's probably the best that I've ever seen. I've never noticed the entire crowd standing up and screaming the entire game without any breaks. I cannot think of any moment in that game where people weren't sitting up and screaming aside from maybe halftime. It's even at the end of the game when it was garbage time, everyone was screaming, waving their towels. I thought the towels was a really nice touch, and I think that's something that we should utilize more. A lot of NFL teams will utilize that to great effect. I think it just adds a lot to the energy. But credit to the Notre Dame fans, credit to the university. They really brought it for the home football playoff game, and I mean it was a tremendous experience the entire day, not even just the game. I feel like tailgating, people were up and about early. It was freezing cold, but everyone was having a good time. The tailgate experience felt like it normally does, and I mean that in a good way. It felt like it was kind of you had the traditional Notre Dame tailgating experience, but there was obviously extra energy because everyone was so amped up about the playoffs. So yeah, I think I could just go on and on about the day, but I would say it actually was beyond my expectations. Just the excitement. Obviously, we won the game by a pretty healthy margin, but yeah, fantastic experience. I hope this is a yearly tradition. I hope we make the playoff every year and get to host a home playoff game because this is something that I would try to get back to again and again. And yeah, it was cold, but I did get a cold. Brett and some other people, as I mentioned, they also got sick too, but well worth it to experience something like that.
Yeah, it's why we're recording, I guess, a week since the game. So apologies to our listeners here for getting this recap and Sugar Bowl preview out a little later here. But between Christmas holiday and getting over some illness, took us a little bit here to get on the airwaves. And the word I've been reflecting on a lot from that game day experience was it was joyful. Like the entire day was one big celebration of Notre Dame. I heard some of the beat writers describe it that way too. And I think across college football, there were a lot of really cool environments. But a lot of what I read about, say, Ohio State and some Tennessee fan experiences was hostile, like just ugly stuff going on and people being jerks. And just, I don't think what sports is all about. It's one of the reasons why we do this show. We do this show to try to have a glass half full, fun, optimistic take, albeit with a data analytics driven approach that some might find boring, but we here on the show really enjoy, and I hope our listeners do too. And I felt like Notre Dame really encapsulated that environment. We were hanging out with IU fans. An IU fan gave me a burger because theirs were done before ours was done, and we gave them a burger back. We were playing flip cup. Like it was just a fun day of college football for I don't want to call it a rivalry, but an in-state matchup, battle of the Hoosier State. And I think it's what college football is all about. We were talking before we got on recording. If you go look at ticket prices for the first round on campus games versus now these neutral site bowl games, ticket prices have plummeted for the second round and they're better matchups. Like this is a way better matchup against Georgia than it is against Indiana or, Ohio State, Oregon is like, would have I think been the cheapest ticket to get for the first round is now the most expensive ticket to get in the second round. But that tells you something. It's still like fans are paying less money to go to the Rose Bowl than they would for these on campus games. College football belongs on campuses. Like, it's a reason why college is in the name of it. And it was such a joyful celebration for Notre Dame that I wish every college football fan, if you didn't get to go this year, next time Notre Dame's back, strongly encourage you to make the trip in the winter, in the snow. Like, it was such an awesome experience as a sports fan. Let's turn to the game. Mike, how would you describe this game, how it played out, how the outcome ended up 27-17? Like, where did that fit relative to what we were thinking?
Well, Brett, before this, we were essentially talking about how we needed to give ourselves flowers for, I guess, our prediction for this game. Because essentially what we called out is exactly how it played out. So Brett and I said that basically IU's offense, the way they matched up against our defense was such that we expected that they wouldn't really be able to generate a ton in the passing game. We thought they've been effective. Their quarterback, if you give him time, yes, he can slice and dice some defenses, but we didn't think the receivers were of the profile that would be able to really stress test our secondary. They're just not those elite types of NFL draft prospects that you find at some other programs. And that was exactly right. So the passing game was not, they weren't really able to get much going in that. We were able to get a lot of pressure on Rourke, and he's someone who struggled under pressure. Certainly, he's not mobile, so that limited what he was able to do. And then we mentioned the running game, and the running game was okay. It was pretty solid, I think, for most of the year, but it wasn't something that we thought they would be able to utilize effectively to generate a lot of successful plays against us. And that's exactly right. And I think we bottled it up maybe even more than I expected. I mean, we were completely shutting them down. So I think on that side of the ball, that played out exactly as we expected. And then for Notre Dame's offense, it was pretty much exactly what we predicted as well. We knew that they were a good run defense, but they were susceptible to giving up some big plays. And that's exactly what happened. They generally contained us in the run game, but we broke off some big plays. Jeremiah Love, in particular, that 98-yard touchdown run. I also have to call out the guy in front of us who, about 20 seconds before that play, right after the interception, he's like, looks at me and Brett, and he says, "How beautiful would it be if we have a 98-yard Jeremiah Love touchdown right now?" And then lo and behold, 20 seconds later, that's exactly what happens. So that guy, got to give some credit to him for basically being a prophet in that situation. And then in the passing game, we knew that IU had a little bit of leakiness in their secondary. Not bad. They're not bad, but that was an area that they were a little more susceptible. But we didn't necessarily believe that we'd be able to really, really take advantage of that. And we didn't. Look, Riley Leonard was effective, but it wasn't an area where we generated a ton of explosive plays. So basically, we thought our defense would shut down their offense, which they did, and we thought our offense would be slow. We'd be slowed down by IU's defense for large chunks of the game, but we'd be able to generate enough points to be able to win the game. And I think that's exactly right. If anything, I think we did it. I think Notre Dame actually performed in that manner even more effectively than we expected. So fun to see Notre Dame play lights out. And look, it's not I'll take it as like an added benefit that what we expected for the game and what we called out played out almost exactly what we were thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on offense, we talked about IU's front seven being one of the best in the country. In fact, they're number one in the country in line yards allowed, which means they are statistically the best team at controlling the line of scrimmage. If you remove Jeremiah Love's 98-yard touchdown run, which, by the way, you can't remove, it was the game defining play. But for the rest of the game, Jadarian Price, Riley Leonard, and Jeremiah Love all generated less than 3 yards per carry. Like, we were not generating a consistent push at the offensive line. And similarly, Riley Leonard was under pressure 45% of dropbacks. Now, he limited that to just 3 sacks. In fact, his production under pressure was better than it was in terms of yards per attempt. It was better under pressure than it was when he was not under pressure. We've talked about all year, Riley Leonard has really struggled under pressure. He changed that in this game. I thought that was one big surprise if we're talking about an area where we weren't expecting Riley Leonard to do well. That's where he generated a lot of his 200 yards. That's how we kept a 16-yard play going to go get our second touchdown drive. That is where I thought outside of the Love touchdown, we generated enough on offense was Leonard avoiding sacks, keeping the chains moving with his arm in really a game manager role. but not to a big stat line. Like you look up and he's got 200 yards passing. It's not like he won the game passing, but he did enough passing, especially under pressure. And I use front seven, tip your hat. They really controlled this game for large stretches, just ultimately, especially with the Jeremiah Love highlight, too much from Notre Dame's explosiveness. And then on the other side, yeah, we thought IU had a great offense, but all year had not seen a lot of great defenses. They've seen a few against Ohio State and Michigan and Washington and Nebraska, and generally struggled against those better defenses. But other than Ohio State, hadn't seen a defense like Notre Dame's. And Notre Dame's defense was number two in the country, maybe number one in the country at success rate allowed of just 34%. So in terms of opposing offenses staying on schedule, Al Golden is the best at disrupting that. Not letting them get meaningful yards on first down, not letting them use second down to set up with third and short, and not letting them convert on third down. IU's offense was number one in that category at staying on schedule 54% of the time. So you've got our defense, number one at 34%. You've got their offense at number one, 54%. And we thought because of the talent disparity, Al Golden was going to win out. IU's success rate in this game was 34%. It hit Notre Dame's season average. And if you said, you had those goalposts of 34% to 54%, we said, look, we really don't think it's going to be close to 54%. And we were spot on. IU could not stay on schedule in this game. In fact, really until the last two drives when it was 27-3 in a blowout, they had just 152 yards of offense through the first 55 minutes of this game. It was a dominating performance statistically for Al Golden. We didn't do it with a ton of havoc, but we did it by controlling the line of scrimmage. They had just 3.5 yards per carry, just 1.9 yards before contact. Offenses want to have about 2.5 to 3 yards before contact. That's when you're really generating a consistent push. We limited that to below two lines, so we were below 2 yards per carry. So we were dominating the line of scrimmage. And then we were just physically too much. Their number one rideout, Elijah Surratt, was targeted a bunch. He was held to just 67 yards. Like they just really didn't get anything going offensively until those last two drives in garbage time. And again, just as we'll say it, exactly as we would have expected. Mike, where did we get things wrong? Where did things go better than expected?
Yeah, so this is where it's great to nitpick areas that we didn't totally nail because we really weren't that far off in many aspects of this game, but there were some that maybe went better than expected, which is a fun aspect to reflect on. So with Curtis Rourke, we hinted that he was someone who struggled under pressure. It wasn't I wouldn't it wasn't one of our keys to the game in the preview, but we definitely mentioned that he wasn't as mobile and that he certainly wasn't as effective when he was under duress. And Ohio State used that to great success in their game against him. So we certainly suggested that getting pressure on him was going to be important, even though it wasn't one of the couple main keys that we called out. But we this was an area that Notre Dame, at first glance, you would think that maybe we didn't excel at it. We only generated 21 pressures on work dropbacks. Generally, you want to be in the high 30s or 40s. That's a rate where you're getting to the quarterback at a better clip and really impacting his game. But so while our rate wasn't as high, I think the one thing that is interesting here is that when we were able to get pressure, though, that pressure was very impactful. So 0 completions, 0. So when we did get pressure on him, no completions, and 3 sacks. So look, I think it's like 3 sacks, 0 completions, 21% of his dropbacks. Even though you'd like that rate to be 30 to 40% of pressures, if what you're generating in those pressure situations is basically to where the offense does nothing, I think that's something that you got to be happy with. So pressure rate wasn't as high as you'd like, but it was very impactful pressure. And then interestingly, Notre Dame, we just had a 10% havoc rate for this game, which reflects, I guess, that lower pressure rate. But again, it's that the impact from that havoc that we did generate that really flipped the game. The 3 sacks, big time Xavier Watson interception. Not all havoc is created equal. So and I think that's something to keep in mind for this game. And then I think the other one that I want to call out here, and we've already discussed this a little bit, was with whether or not our passing game would be able to take advantage of IU's secondary, which is one of the weaker spots on their defense. And we didn't, I guess, Brent, we were both pretty skeptical. And I wouldn't say that we got this wrong because it's not like Leonard absolutely lit them on fire, but he was effective, I think. So I think he was certainly a little bit better than we expected. Certainly better than we expected when he was under pressure, and he was pressured quite a bit. So that was a key to the game. But if you call out some stats here, the more I dug into his performance, the better it looked. Honestly, like I rewatched the game, and there really weren't. I couldn't really find many bad throws that he made. Most of his incompletions were him throwing it away. Even that interception early in the game was pretty fluky. It just kind of flicked off a guy's hand and kind of bounced in a funny direction, and they were able to get it. For instance, he had an 89% adjusted completion rate, just dinged by two drops and a throwaway. And I think one play in particular that I really hope that we see this more going forward from him was that 49-yarder to phase on to set up that Leonard essentially walk-in touchdown. I think that's his best throw of the year. It was, I think, every aspect of it from a talent evaluator is what you want to see. There was pressure. He stepped up in the pocket and then flung an absolute dime downfield to Faison, and it was beautiful. I think one beat reporter said Leonard may not be a top tier NFL prospect, but on that one play, that was a top tier NFL play. That's the type of play that when you're looking at first round draft picks, particularly high first round draft picks, it's just littered with those types of plays. So nice to see. We've seen him improve as the season has gone on, but it's particularly nice to see perhaps his best play, his best throw of the year happen uh, as of in the playoff as we're getting late in the season. So gives you hope that we continue to see more of that moving forward. So that was great. Again, not an area that we got wrong, but I think Leonard exceeded our expectations a little bit in terms of his production against IU secondary.
Totally. And, we always love focusing on players who stood out in this game. I think Riley Leonard is a really, really big narrative in this game. I know Jeremiah Love had the highlight. I know Jeremiah Love grabbed the attention for that 98-yard touchdown run. I thought over the course of 60 minutes of football, Riley Leonard was our best offensive player in this game. And when you hear stats like 89% adjusted completion rate, like you just don't see that very often. Like that is passing at a very high efficient clip, despite being under pressure 45% of the time, despite playing a really, really good Indiana defense. In terms of guys to call out on the defensive side of the ball for Notre Dame, I feel like we're saying this every game. Like, I get it. Xavier Watts has the All-American play with the huge interception to get Notre Dame the ball back. But at that point in the game, like, we had just turned it over. They're set up in prime position. I mean, it is the classic, like, if this game is going to get off the rails, it is us turning it over, them getting points in a short field, and Xavier Watts just wipes out what otherwise could have been a devastating start. Other than that, it's another narrative of so many contributors on this Al Golden defense. So a stat I like to look at is called stops that Pro Football Focus makes, that tracks, and it is tackles that result in a failure for the offense. And so these are tackles for loss, open field tackles, like plays where, man, other than that tackle, this was a really big opportunity for the offense. We had 7 different players with multiple stops, 2 or more, like big time tackles, big time game changing, drive changing, move the offense backward stops. And they weren't always sacks. They weren't always disruptive tackles for losses, but just very, very solid football play. And so I'm just going to call them all out. I know it's 7 guys, but you had Clark, Kaiser, Mills, Burnham, Bowen, Osbury, Xavier Watts. I'm not even mentioning Howard Cross, who, by the way, I think led the defensive line in snaps played, and I thought was all over this field, even if he wasn't generating tackles. It was great to see him back in the game. This is without Ben Morrison. This is without Traore. This is without Patello. Like, it's just time and time again, there's so many guys stepping up and having a really big impact. Leonard Moore in the secondary, he was targeted 6 times and gives up just 1 catch for 17 yards. 1 catch for 17 yards against the number 1 pass efficiency offense in the country. And our true freshman stepping in for Ben Morrison, just lights out performance. So many contributors on that defense that it is really, this isn't about 1 or 2 star guys anymore. This is about a collective playing within Al Golden's scheme. It's just really fun football to watch. Mike, turn into another topic. It was 27-3. It was a blowout. The celebration was on, and a long touchdown drive, an onside kick, almost another onside kick. Like, this got a little close at the end. The score definitely doesn't reflect how dominating this game was, but are we concerned about the end of this game? And maybe I'll tie that into a bigger picture. Just thoughts on Marcus Freeman and in his coaching performance in his first playoff game?
Yeah, I'll take the first part of that one first. So, short answer, no. The game was statistically over. Honestly, it was a bit annoying though. It would have been nice to get the credit in the final score. I think we should look at our onside kick unit and see if there's anything we need to clean up there. Although when I rewatched that play, that honestly was a perfect onside kick. You can't draw it up any better than that. It's unlikely that another team would be able to kick another onside kick like that perfectly. And I mean, really, they did it. The first one was perfect. The second one was pretty good too, although we were able to recover it. So I think you look at it and see if there's something we can adjust there to not allow that to happen. Because realistically, the recovery of an onside kick should be a very low probability proposition. They were able to get one, and again, I think a lot of that was aided by a really like textbook kick. And then in terms of actually letting them go downfield and score, I'm not too concerned there either. It was garbage time. You'd like to see your defense play a bit better. We were running a lot of uh, if not prevent, like I would say, formations and plays that were erring more on the side of prevent. Al Golden even admitted that he was holding back on certain wrinkles. He didn't want to tip his hand with certain patterns for Georgia to kind of dissect when they get to the game planning. And we didn't have all of our starters in for those plays. I think certainly after they scored and they were moving downfield again, we started moving some of our starters back in. But it's it really was just garbage time. So you don't want to overreact to it. Again, you'd like to see the team do better in that scenario, but there are a lot of caveats to make there. And then for the broader part of your question on Marcus Freeman and his biggest game, I think this is really what we've seen from Marcus Freeman. He's tended to show up for the biggest moments. I think Signetti, who was talking a big game, talking a lot of trash going in, he does have a lot of playoff experience, but it's at the FCS level. I think Marcus Freeman showed himself well against someone who is, you know, and for someone like Signetti, who's he has playoff experience, but maybe isn't the quite in the spotlight at the biggest stage to this extent. Um, Whereas Freeman has been he's been in some big games before like this. I think Freeman showed certainly some of the experience he's picked up over the years. I think the field goal formation prior to the block where we showed a fake and then Signetti called a timeout while they were trailing in the second half. That's great because I mean, look, that obviously didn't tilt the balance of the game, but you never know what can happen at the end of the game. That extra timeout or that not having that extra timeout that could have been absolutely critical for IU if say they were down one touchdown with the ball and they had to go all the way downfield. So I think that's just little things that you can do to win the chess match. We only had one other marker for discipline that you can always look at to see if you think the team has been instilled with the proper discipline is penalty yards. We only had 35 penalty yards. And then I think another big thing is just in terms of in-game coaching is what we can't say about you. So Signetti had some questionable decision making. He kicked a field goal on 4th and 4 in the red zone. That's a scenario where if you want to knock out a heavyweight team like Notre Dame, the analytics and I think just generally like the vibe of trying to instill your team with confidence would just suggest that you kind of go for the home run there. And they were down 14-0 at the time. So that's really where you want to try to make up that score differential. And then punting again down 3 scores from midfield, that's almost essentially conceding the game when you're in the biggest game of your life. And then there were a few head scratching play calls I can remember too. I think one time they ran the ball up the middle on like 3rd and 10 or something like that. And I think and the run game had really not been that effective for most of the game. They had a couple of runs early in the game, but certainly later in the game we had pretty much been stuffing them consistently for a while. So I think Marcus Freeman looked like he had the boys fired up. He looked like they had them ready to make a statement. And then the other looked like he was playing not to lose. It looked like he was playing conservatively. He wasn't going for these home run type plays, even when the analytics suggested that he should. So I think it's kind of going back to my earlier point. I think it's just a testament to Marcus Freeman that there's really not much that we can nitpick about this game. If the only thing you can really say is just that we could have done a little bit better in garbage time, I feel like that's about as a good of a coaching performance as you could hope for.
So let's use the rest of the IU recap to think about how this sets up Notre Dame for the stretch run. So, what did we see in this game that gets us excited that says, hey, Notre Dame's not only got a fighter's chance against Georgia, has a fighter's chance against this whole field and can really maybe make a run for a championship here? Versus like what concerns now came up because of this game. So I'll start with the positives, and we've talked about it already, so I'll hit it quickly. Riley Leonard under pressure has been what we think one of the biggest weaknesses of our offense all year, where Yes, every quarterback, when they're under duress, their performance is going to drop off. But Riley Leonard really drops off when he's under pressure. Not in this game. He was 7 for 11 for 81 yards under pressure. That's actually a higher yards per attempt than when he had a clean pocket. Really great to see him step up in that way. If that can be built upon, remember, he's a year one starter at Notre Dame, and this entire offense is a year one starter under Mike Denbrock. And so if we can continue to build that familiarity here, use, frankly, a lot of extra prep time, a lot of extra practice time leads up to these bowl games here over the course of a season where you're not just getting, 2 days to install the offense, 1 day to run it, and then it's game day. Here, you're getting a lot more practice time to really work on installing the system. The other one that I think is a reason to both be excited for the stretch run and maybe a reason for concern, so a good transition answer here, is Mitch Jeter in the kicking game. Makes 2 big field goals. Watching Marcus Freeman reaction after the first field goal, a huge pump up for his guy. They got Mitch Jeter like on a hot mic yelling like, "I'm back," and the entire sideline being fired up, but led by Marcus Freeman. And my brother called this out to me, so I went back and watched it on replay. It is the exact type of coaching you love to see. It is like, I always love saying this, especially against Indiana, but if I can find the antithesis of Bob Knight, the antithesis of the coach that rips down their players and makes them feel like crap and makes them feel like all they are is mistakes, versus the coach who builds you up, makes you better, motivates you, believes in you, is hard on you, is disciplined, but makes you the best version of yourself on and off the field. That was Marcus Freeman firing up Mitch Jeter after that kick. I thought it was one of the coolest moments we've had on our sideline, that certainly this year, but that I can remember in a really, really long time for a guy with an up and down season, both physical health. Also, I think you got to talk a little bit about the yips and mental health for a kicker. Really, really cool. Makes 2 huge field goals in this game. And on the other side, has a chip shot blocked in the fourth quarter, or maybe it was third quarter. There's just a total chippy. And it looked like the entire right side of our offensive line just didn't block like the IU defense. So for sure not executed right by the offensive line in that situation. I thought, especially for a shorter field goal, Jeter caught it really low. Like on short field goals,
Yeah.
like you should just be able to, kind of chip it over the line. Like you don't need to drive the low line drive field goal because distance isn't as big of a concern. So across the board, I just thought poor execution. And it's a really interesting context against Georgia. According to SP Plus, Georgia has a top 10 special teams, and against an average special teams, Georgia has a 2-point advantage in a game. For context, that is bonkers that your special teams in an average game can drive you a 2-point advantage. Notre Dame's special teams ranked 104th. So I get we've got our own blocks. I get we've got some really cool fakes. But when we don't have any return game, we fair catch everything, and our kicking game has been a massive struggle. That results to SP Plus predicting that our special teams will detract 1.3 points. And you put that together, Georgia has about a 3-point advantage on special teams, about a field goal. That's a huge, huge deciding factor going into a playoff scenario that, for example, Notre Dame's a 1.5-point underdog right now. The statistical models are saying that Notre Dame's offense and defense is actually better than Georgia by 1.5. But our special teams is such a drag relative to how good Georgia's is that it makes us a 1.5-point underdog. That's like frustrating as a fan. Like, we got to go look at our special teams coaching, execution, what guys are playing on those units. Do we have 5'7" walk-on snappers, or do we got, like the legit scholarship guys out there playing every facet of the game for us? So there's huge reason to be optimistic that if we can go and get 1 or 2 moments out of Mitch Jeter and we can just make special teams neutral, that could be a huge, huge, huge plus relative to how Indy has played throughout this season. Keep in mind, our one loss, we had 2 field goals blocked, and we lost by 2. Or is what we saw in that third field goal attempt be like, guys, here we are again. Like, you got to be able to go 3 for 3 on field goals in a big game.
For sure. And I think even 2 of 3, that's an uptick from what we've seen from large stretches
Totally.
this season. Yeah, I don't even know if that would necessarily be neutral, but that would be a lot closer to neutral than what we've seen this year. So, yeah, it's interesting. It's cause for concern, but it's also cause for hope because we do believe that Jeter is hopefully getting healthy, and I think that that long field goal that he hit should hopefully be big for him moving forward. And if that's the case, the spread could be understating, I guess, what our potential is. Now, that block field goal was pretty frustrating for me, as I mentioned to Brett before we started recording, because I had a score prediction of 30 points for Notre Dame, and at the time when I predicted that, Brett gave me a lot of flack. He's like, "Oh, if you're picking 30, that means that's like a really unlikely score." And I was sitting next to him at the game right before he kicked the field goal. I was like, "Hey, Brett, if he hits this, we're gonna get 30 points." And then, sure enough, he missed the field goal. But
Don't forget
very,
that one of my fantasy things draft of unlikely things to happen was 4 field goals. And when Jeter lined up for the third one, I was like, why did I say three? Because three
yeah,
three field goals for Notre Dame would also have been wildly unlikely. And then, of course, it gets blocked, so it didn't matter. So
and
we
Faison
got to go
had
beat Georgia 12-9. Like, we got to go have a
yeah,
field goal game.
and your 100 receiving yards for
It's
receiver. Like
very close.
Faison actually was pretty close. And at one point in the broadcast, when I went back and watched it when I got home, I think at one point they said that Faison had 100 yards. I was like, what? And then I checked and they corrected themselves. It was actually 89 yards, I believe. But yeah, you're
Yeah.
you're dangerously close. Some of my predictions I think are a little less likely. I don't think Brian Kelly was on the verge of becoming an analyst at any point during that, or uh, and hey, but Riley Leonard had that NFL throw. So if he does that like 20 times, over the next couple games, assuming we win, then maybe we're getting to the point to where he's moving up some draft boards. Um, but yeah, I'll move on to another related portion of this, and that's just reasons for concern outside of our field goal protection. And I'm going to start with one that I don't think this is a concern, but just looking at the stats, it's something that I feel like we have to call out because the stats, I think, essentially require that we call it out. So Jordan Clark and Christian Gray, who have generally been very solid this year. Gray was a little leakier versus USC, but made up for it with that pick six. They were targeted a combined 13 times and gave up 9 catches for 113 yards and 2 touchdowns. So that's not great, but the majority of that was in garbage time, which was we called out. We kind of took our foot off the brake. So I don't want to stress about it too much. But whenever you see stats like that, you definitely have to call it out. As a potential area for concern. But as I mentioned, I think just given the circumstances and how these guys have looked for large stretches of the year, I think that's going to be more of an anomaly. And I think we'll get back to seeing how they typically are against Georgia. And then Brett, the other one, I'm going to kick it over to you. I think the other area of concern that we have to talk about is injuries, because the injury bug started earlier this year and it really has not gone away at any point this season.
It's brutal. Notre Dame had some terrible Christmas news after the IU game. Riley Mills is out for the season with a knee injury. I think you'd probably got to be living under a rock if you're a Notre Dame fan to have not heard about this, but you just start looking at how much has amassed, especially on the D line. You're down Bubakar Traore, you're down Jordan Botello, now Riley Mills. KSA is questionable. He missed the IU game, but sounds like he might be back. Howard Cross is now back fully healthy, but has been out with injury. And who knows if he's 100% or just, fully healthy enough to be back and playing. It's worth calling out Jason Anya has missed the last 7 or 8 games. He left the team for personal reasons in September. So this is a very thin defensive line here. And now down their All-American and Riley Mills. I thought Marcus Freeman said it really well. It's going to be tough, but we'll figure out a way to replace his production. It's going to be impossible to replace his leadership. And, at some point, I don't know if it's in the Georgia game. I don't know if it's in the semis. I don't know if it's in the championship, but at some point, it would not surprise me if we're sitting here saying, gosh, our defensive line just didn't hold up in the second half. And I think at this point, it's an attrition. I have all the faith in the world in Gabriel Rubio and Donovan Heinisch, but you know we're down to 2 contributors there in the middle of the defense. Bryce Young, true freshman, has looked really, really good. He's going to have to step up. We've already been moving Burnham and Drake Bone, who are more outside linebackers that are edge rushers, kind of in that Viper, whatever kind of role you want to call it, but are more outside linebackers. They're basically defensive ends now. And so, we're cross training guys at different roles. Al Golden's figuring out ways to scheme around it, but no doubt about it, add Ben Morrison on top of it. Like, this defense has just gotten beat up. Rocco Spindler is also now questionable after sustaining an injury against IU. There was really big news. The highly touted sophomore Charles Jugasa, he had I believe, a shoulder, a pec injury
Yeah.
in the preseason in summer camp. He was expected to be out for the year, but officially got cleared and is back for the Sugar Bowl. I'd say normally, okay, a guy hasn't played all year. Is he really going to be a contributor? I do think it's important to remember he was in a similar spot last year. He didn't play against Joe Alt and Blake Fisher, our starting offensive tackles, and they were first and second, first and third round draft picks in the NFL. And they both didn't play in last year's bowl game against Oregon State because they opted and declared for the NFL draft. And Charles Jugasa was a first time starter and dominated against Oregon State. And I get Oregon State is not Georgia, especially for all the opt outs they had in that bowl game. But he did play for an entire year, came in, started, and did very, very well. My question is actually who you move around because he is a very, very true outside tackle. Like he is not an interior lineman. And really, I don't think Emil Wagner is either when you look at their two frames. So the real question is could true freshman Anthony Knapp, who's been playing tackle all year, but he's 6'4, it's kind of an undersized offensive tackle, could he slide in and play guard? Or do you keep kind of rotating within our existing two deep on the interior line, and then I don't know what you do with Jugasa. So there's a real question there if Rocco Spindler's healthy. But Charles Jugasa is supposed to be our best lineman this year. Like that was all of the talk coming out of camp was he was by far our most dominant piece on the front line there. If he's back healthy and contributing, it's a really interesting wrinkle to upgrade the offensive line. But I view that more as like a maybe versus I know Riley Mills losing him is a big detraction. I know Rocco Spindler not being healthy is a detraction. And so I think the injury bug here is coming at a bad time. I think it's a good transition to Georgia. They're clearly without one of their best players in Carson Beck, their starting quarterback, really one of the best quarterbacks in the country. So everyone's dealing with injuries. And, I think ours is more in quantity than it is any one guy. But I think part of that quantity is how concentrated it is on the defensive line.
Totally agree. I've been impressed with our level of depth this year. We've had all these injuries and our defense has generally been able to keep chugging along without much of a drop off. But as we've called out in prior shows, the question becomes does that attrition, does it catch up to you when you start playing teams like Georgia or, these teams that are elite caliber programs that you face deep in the playoff? And that's really the unknown right now, I think, is are we going to see some impact here? The one thing with Gabriel Rubio, who's going to step in and play a lot more reps in the place of someone like Riley Mills, is he's apparently grades out better against the run. But what we're really missing from Riley Mills, as you mentioned, the leadership, but then also the pass rush. And when we've had healthy Mills, in the middle. He really pushes back that interior offensive line and is extremely disruptive. Him and Cross, when they're both in at the same time, they can be extremely disruptive on that interior pass rush and make the quarterback really uncomfortable. So we'll see. I think this is the deepest Notre Dame team that I've seen since I've been a fan. It just becomes a question of like when you start stress testing it. At what point do we start seeing a bigger drop off? So I'm overall optimistic that we'll be able to hang in there, but I think even some beat writers like Pete Sampson have mentioned that they think we could perhaps get by against Georgia. Certainly not to the point of where we're a favorite. We're not a favorite, but we could potentially get by. But where it becomes tricky is with all these injuries. Do you have enough to win 3 games in a row against just top competition? And I think that's where it gets a little bit trickier. But with that, Brett, I think we should move on to our opponent, the Georgia Bulldogs, which is a program that we're somewhat familiar with. We've played them in recent memory. And this program is really the preeminent program in college football. They've really been at the top of the sport. Kirby Smart has built a monster. You live in Atlanta, so you have to hear it from Bulldog fans all the time. I think it might just be helpful to have a quick overview of what Kirby Smart has accomplished.
Absolutely. I mean, it's crazy. It feels like yesterday he took that job. He's been there, I think, 9 seasons now. He has maybe 10. He's at 8 straight seasons of making a New Year's Six or college football playoff game. Only once in the last 4 years has he missed the playoff. And that was last year by way of losing an all time great SEC championship game. And it was their only loss. They went from undefeated regular season number one to missing out on the playoff. Is really one of the best examples of why people wanted the college football playoff expanded to 12 teams, why it's structured the way it is so teams aren't punished in those conference title games. It was Georgia losing to Bama last year, arguably the best team in the country gets left out. I keep thinking like, yeah, that's the only reason why, that team from up north got their championship.
Yep.
Recruiting has been top notch. They're number two in the 24/7 talent composite. They have 14 five-star players that will be going up against Notre Dame on New Year's Day. We have one. So this is by far the biggest talent disparity that Notre Dame will play all year. 14 5 stars against one. And, you know, all of that being said, this isn't the juggernaut Georgia Kirby Smart teams that we've seen. In 2018, 21, 22, and 23, the SP Plus model, and I'll caveat this in a second, but the SP Plus model said that if one of those four Georgia teams played this year's Georgia team, they would be 7 point favorites. They would be a touchdown favorite against the team that Notre Dame's going up against. Now, it's really bad math to use SP Plus that way. The model is not built to look across years. The game changes so much. How you look at average competition changes. Like the model isn't designed to work that way. But I do think it's an interesting data point to just show they were by far and away better teams in those prior 4 years relative to the competition than they are this year. And I think the surprising part is for all the negative narrative around Carson Beck's play this year, their defense is the part that slipped. They're still top 10. Don't get me wrong. They are the number 10 team in SP Plus on defense. They were number 5 last year. Before that, they had their number 1 SP Plus defensive team for 4 straight years. So what made them such a juggernaut was their defense was just like there was a year where against an average offense, they were expected to give up 3 points. That is absurd. It's still absurd. They're still projected to give up, I think it's something like, 11 or 12 points. Like they're still dominant, but they are not this like, holy cow, it feels like you're going up against an NFL defense. That's the area that I think has slipped here a little bit, not in a big way, but that slipped a little bit. And then I think the last thing to call out, in addition to being both top 10 on offense and defense, like Notre Dame, their offense is actually number 5, so very, very similar to Notre Dame. They are dominant under Kirby Smart in these big games. They are 8-2 in New Year's Six and playoff games. They have won 7 in a row in such big matchups and a lot of blowouts. They beat Florida State last year 63-3 in the Orange Bowl. Now I get it. Florida State had a bunch of injuries and opt-outs. The year before that, they beat TCU in the championship game 65-7. In 2023, they blew out Michigan 34-11 in the semis. Like when you give Kirby Smart multiple weeks to prepare, his track record is lethal. It's scary. It is very Nick Saban-esque is I think really the only way to put it, where he plays up in these big games like no one else in college football. You just got to ask yourself, but he's not that number 1 team in the country anymore. He's really, really good. He's one of the best teams in the country, but he's not the cream of the crop this year that I think gives Notre Dame a chance.
Agree. I think Saban-esque is the best way to put it because that's exactly what I was thinking. Now diving into this roster, I'm going to start with the offense. As you mentioned, Brett, despite what you might hear in the media, despite fan perception, this has really been the strong side of the ball for them this year. And with that, I think that I'm going to start with the main headline on offense, and that's Carson Beck. So unless you've been living under a rock, you would have heard that Carson Beck is out for the game. So this has been their star quarterback all year. He was going into the year projected as a potential first round pick. He slipped a bit. He had a very bad arm injury to his throwing elbow in the SEC championship game. And you could even tell from that one play that he was seriously injured. And right when he got hurt, I would have been surprised if he was able to play for the rest of the playoffs. It looked pretty serious. But Beck, with the narrative has been, I've seen this from some SEC fans and some Georgia Bulldog fans, has been that, okay, like at times he's been a little bit spotty this year. Maybe we're better if he's hurt, and maybe we're better if we have a backup quarterback. I think so. I don't buy that at all. I think Beck is look. He's had a couple moments where he's, as I mentioned, been a little spottier. But if you look at his stats and his production over the course of the year, I think it really dismisses that attitude that a backup would generally be able to perform better than him. So per Pro Football Focus, he's the number 24 graded quarterback, number 11 in yards, 28 touchdowns on the year. So for context, that's only one behind Curtis Rourke and Will Howard, tied with Dylan Gabriel, and two more than Quinn Ewers. So basically, when you look at all these stats and how he's grading out, pick your top quarterback, and Carson Beck is right there with them. And I mentioned number 24 on Pro Football Focus as a quarterback. Well, Georgia's also had one of the toughest schedules in the country. So Pro Football Focus, their grades are not opponent adjusted. So number 24, that would suggest that, if it's not opponent adjusted, he's probably actually like ranks higher than that. The one concern that a lot of naysayers for Carson Beck has been interceptions. So he has 12 this year, and it's really just been in 3 games, 3 against Alabama, Texas, and Florida. But since that stretch, he had 0 in the month of November. So it seemed like we were getting back to the Carson Beck that people were expecting later in the year. So look, all in all, I think this guy is a top college quarterback. I think his stock slipped a little bit. He certainly is not a first round prospect that most people thought he would be. But look, I think he's still one of the better quarterbacks in all of college football. And now the keys are getting turned over to a 4-star prospect named Gunnar Stockton. And Gunnar he looked okay against Texas. He came in, quickly led them to a touchdown. But after that, Texas really seemed to limit what they were able to do on offense. So it seemed like they were able to there was some initial energy that Gunnar was able to inject into Georgia's offense. But after that, Texas seemed to kind of figure it out. So I would say based on that, I'm not optimistic that this is like a Jalen Hurts, like Tua scenario where both those guys, good NFL quarterbacks, right? I don't think this is that situation. I think this guy is certainly I think it's likely that he's a downgrade from Carson Beck. He's very limited in his experience. And at this point, I would be surprised if his skill level is anything close to Carson Beck's. He is more mobile, so that's something that we'll have to plan for, but we do have time to plan for it. So I guess in summary, I think this is a hit to their offense. Their offense was, as you mentioned, Brett, one of the top in the country per SP Plus. A lot of that was due to Carson Beck, despite what some people might have you believe. But now that Carson Beck is out, I think this will impact their offense.
For sure. And if you look at what makes this offense hum, it's a really balanced passing game at wide receiver. They have 3 wide receivers averaging 3 catches per game. They have 3 different tight ends averaging 2 catches per game. So a bunch of weapons, but no one standout. The leading receiver has 734 yards of offense. If this sounds familiar, it should. It looks a lot like Notre Dame, but just more prolific in terms of Notre Dame having 2,500 total passing yards on the year compared to 3,700 for Georgia. I think that's actually a really big testament to just how good Carson Beck is. He has 50% more passing yards per game against some really good SEC defenses relative to Riley Leonard. And then a really great two-headed monster at running back, Trevor Etienne and Nate Frazier. They both average about 5 yards per carry, 17 touchdowns between the two of them, totaling 1,200 yards, despite, I think, both, but for sure, Trevor Etienne missing some time down the stretch due to injury. So also very similar to Notre Dame with a two-headed monster, but maybe not quite as prolific. And so Etienne is back. He's been dealing with a rib injury, but he's expected to play. They've also had some other injuries here. Their third and fourth options at running back have been out for most of the season, although Kirby Smart thinks they're getting close to returning. And then importantly, I think this offense is the exact opposite of what we talked about for Indiana in the sense that this offense has been tested. They've played against 7 top 20 defenses according to SP Plus, and they've performed really well in those 7 games. They've averaged 27 points. And I get it. It's easy to look at the Ole Miss game where they really laid a goose egg. It's easy to look at the SEC championship where they struggled pretty mightily against Texas to generate a consistent offense. But Ole Miss and Texas are both top 5 defenses. I think it's easy to think about Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss as an offensive juggernaut. That's not true. That was all about Walter Nolan and that defensive front 7 at Ole Miss this year. So this is a super solid offense, some really gaudy numbers despite a really tough slate of opposing defenses. It's really all about, I think, Gunnar Stockton. And can he step up without Carson Beck, who, yes, I understand Carson Beck had turnover issues, but I think one of the most prolific quarterbacks in college football. But Mike, I do think there's a really big glaring weakness here for all of those gaudy stats, and it's about the lack of a star at their skill position. Like, I'll let you go into it a little bit more detail, but there's no George Pickens, there's no Ladd McConkey, there's no DeAndre Smith, there's no Brock Bowers. Like, we've been used to now for a long period of time on these Kirby Smart teams seeing, oh, that's the guy that's going to be in the first or second round of the NFL draft at a skilled position. Like, these Kirby Smart teams are why we always talk about winning college football playoffs are about elite quarterback, wide receiver, skill positions, and the cornerbacks that can stop them. It's because of those types of players that have helped win Kirby Smart championships, and they don't have that this year. I think it's the big weakness that's kind of the absence that we've seen from these prior Kirby Smart teams.
Totally. And look, I wouldn't necessarily classify it as a weakness per se. When you get to teams like Georgia, their rosters are so deep and so talented that look, like even if they're even if they even a position group like wide receiver where they don't have maybe like first round draft picks like they have, it's not a bad unit. It's just when you're getting to the point in the playoff where you're playing another championship contender, it's the one area that could hold you back a bit. It's the one area that another team could exploit. And you're exactly right. So as opposed to guys like George Pickens or Brock Bowers, like you mentioned, they have their top three wide receivers this year are undrafted. They're projected to be undrafted free agents. So sure, a couple of them are 4-star receivers out of high school, but it's just not exactly the same. It's not, we're not going up against Devontae Smith or players like that. It's very different. And look, again, because it's not really like a weakness per se. Some of these guys are still athletes. I don't want to say they're not athletes because they are. Arian Smith allegedly can run a 4.3 40-yard dash. So it's not like we're going against guys from James Madison or something like that. These are guys who still have a lot of athleticism. It's just that they don't have the level of production and the level of I guess like elite production that we've seen from other Georgia receivers in the past. Again, not the same as some of these Alabama squads that we've seen in the past. And I think, Brett, as you mentioned, a key to making a far run in the playoff and contending for a championship in the modern era has been elite production and skill at those skill position players. And so they don't have it at receiver. And I think that they had enough of it at the quarterback position, but now that they have to go with the backup, it's unclear if they have that too. So it's if you have a big drop off at the quarterback position, someone who maybe best case scenario plays solid at quarterback. I think that's a reasonable expectation. At the quarterback position for this game for Gunnar Stockton. I think when you combine that with just kind of good but not great receiver production, that puts them in a different category. I think it's something that could actually hold them back quite a bit. Staying on the topic of these receivers, a topic that we've talked about, I'm gonna kick it back to you is drops. If you want to go into that a little bit, because that's an area that this, in addition to maybe the lack of elite production, an area that they have struggled has been dropping the ball.
Yeah, I think it's a great example of what we mean about not having elite production. People want to knock on Carson Beck for maybe having some turnovers and being inaccurate with the football. Well, it's hard to be inaccurate when your guys aren't catching the ball. And Carson Beck is number 3 in the country in a stat that quarterbacks don't want to be good at, and that is number of drops. Carson Beck and this wide has thrown 30 balls that were dropped by Georgia wide receivers and tight ends and running backs this year. That's third in the country. Only 2 other teams have had more drops than Georgia. And so when you think about that, that is literally 11%, or sorry, 9.5% of his attempts are dropped. So when you think about the fact that he's completing 65% of his passes, it could be 75% with drops. And I get it, there's always drops in football, but not at 10%. Like, that is just a really, really, really high drop rate. In fact, Notre Dame's had a case of the dropsies. Like, Riley Leonard is top 35 in this category. He's had 19 drops of his own. So it's an area Notre Dame has struggled with too. And I'd sit here and tell you, yeah, Notre Dame doesn't have a wide receiver bringing in the football. And for example, you mentioned Arian Smith, who runs a 4.3 40, but his big ding is he's a little bit like Will Fuller. Like, sure, he can get open. Sure, he can hit the home run play, but just doesn't hang on to the football. And so I think that's a weakness where if you especially think about Notre Dame being the best coverage team in the country in our secondary, and you don't have that elite production, you don't have guys hanging onto the football, making contested catches. It is not easy to catch a football when you're wide open. it's really hard to catch a football when you got Leonard Moore draped all over you and Xavier Watts draped all over you. So I think that is matchup favorable to Notre Dame, especially with a young quarterback in Gunnar Stockton. I'd be surprised if, these guys for Georgia are going to get the ball right in their numbers every single time, right? Like that's just, there's going to be a drop off at quarterback against a tough coverage in Notre Dame secondary. I think it's just not a great recipe for the Georgia offense. But let's get over to the vaunted Kirby Smart defense. I think there's a big question about, are they gettable this year? And the answer is yeah. Like Alabama put up 41 points. Ole Miss had a lot of success. And I think they've really struggled on the ground in games where you'd be surprised. They blew out UMass 59-21, but the game was pretty darn close at halftime because UMass ran for 226 yards at 5.7 yards per carry. UMass. And this game was in Athens. Now at the same time, like, yes, they've shut down some teams. They've shut down Texas twice, Tennessee. They held Ole Miss to 28 points despite, really their offense committing three brutal turnovers in that Georgia Ole Miss game that kept setting up Ole Miss. So their defense is showing that they can be locked in, focused, and still one of those vaunted Kirby Smart defenses. But it's been inconsistent, and I think it's a reason why they're very solidly a top 15 defense. They're just not that number one defense we've become accustomed to.
Totally. I think really good defense, but you called out one of the Georgia defenses of old that was expected to only give up 3 points against an average offense. So they're not at that. They're not at the level where they could pretty much just single handedly win the game, but they're still really good. And the strength of the defense is it's their pass rush. So Jalen Walker, Butkus Award winner, I believe your mother-in-law Brett taught him in 8th grade. Is that right?
He was at the him and his brother joined the elementary school. So my mother-in-law taught his brother in 3rd grade, missed Jalen, but
Okay.
taught him in the cafeteria and recess and kind of all the general stuff in a small parochial Catholic school. But yeah, know the Walker family well. Good
Okay.
kids.
We'll count it. Yeah, you Brett sent us a picture of Jalen Walker in middle school, and he's like 3 feet taller than every single person in the picture.
He was built different.
You could tell if it was like pick out the future Butkus Award winner in the picture, there would be no question who it was. But so he's like, this is the star on the defense. Like as I mentioned, Butkus Award winner, 29 pressures, 7 sacks. One of those players you have to know where he is on the field at any play because he's that disruptive. And then Chaz Chambliss is another disruptive edge rusher. Same with Michael Williams. So they have a number of players who are very effective at getting to the ball, getting to the quarterback, disrupting the play. This will be a test for our offensive line to see how well we can hold up against this Georgia pass rush. And that's really what it's built about, is just disrupting your passing game. We always talk about success in the playoffs, about elite quarterbacks, wide receiver play, and then how well the other side can defend that with cornerbacks. Kirby Smart has tweaked that formula a little bit. In this case, it's elite edge rushers to disrupt that quarterback. And he's built a Hall of Fame career doing it. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. But as we've said, I think an important caveat to make here, though, is that, and this has been a very positive aspect for Riley Leonard, uh, a pass rush, a particularly effective pass rush, we're kind of built to negate it in a lot of ways. Leonard is he's exceptional at avoiding sacks. And we have such a balanced offense, particularly with our effective run game, that we don't have to rely on the home run passing game as much. So it's not as disruptive from a matchup perspective as it would be, say, for Georgia going up against Texas. So while their pass rush is extremely effective, where you really see that impact is if we're trying to hit the home run threat constantly. So it's one of those scenarios where it's like, okay, you guys are really good at this. It'll impact us for sure, but it won't impact us as much as it would if we, Deshaun
Jack Cohn.
Kaiser throwing Jack
If
Cohn,
it was
exactly.
Jack Cohn, I'd be like, we're toast. Like Jack Cohn took sacks on 25 to 30% of his dropbacks. I actually was just pulling this stat up. Riley Leonard is top 20 in the country at avoiding pressures turning into sacks. He's been under pressure 115 times, and he has only taken 14 sacks. So that's a 12% sack to pressure rate, like pressures that convert into sacks only 12% of the time. That is top 20. Like, he's just mobile. He avoids sacks. He avoids those big disruptive negative plays. And I think to your point, Mike, I think it's a great way of negating what Kirby Smart's trying to do.
Yes, perfect. And thank you, Brett, for for finding me a perfect example there. But yeah, that's exactly right. And I guess like moving on, we talked about the strengths of this defense. It's their pass rush, and we think we match up against this about as favorably as you can. On the other hand, in terms of weaknesses, their secondary is I would say that's a leakier part of their defense. So Dalen Everett, top corner, he gives up about a 70% completion rate. It's very high. And relatively speaking, the secondary grades out fairly poorly. Only 8 interceptions collectively on the season. So they don't generate a ton of impactful plays. They don't generate a ton of havoc. But whereas I would say Riley Leonard is the perfect guy to negate their pass rush, I would say our offense is not the offense that can take advantage of this weakness in their secondary. So we haven't demonstrated an ability to to just generate a ton of offense from home run passing plays. And I guess because of that, that's part of the reason why we're also built to not be susceptible to their pass rush. So it's a little bit of a give and take here. But one area that I think that we can take advantage of is the run defense. So the run defense has been spotty. Brett, you called this out already. And that has been especially true when the opposing offense has a mobile quarterback. You can look at the Georgia Tech game. You can look at the Alabama game as well. I think that's another example. So I've also seen some beat writers from Georgia mention that particularly on run plays on the outside, on the edge, that's an area where they've been a little bit more susceptible. We already mentioned the UMass stats, but I think that this is an area where I think Notre Dame matches up pretty well. I think our run game has been one of the best in the entire country. And with Georgia, it's an area they've been a little weaker, particularly against a mobile quarterback. I think this is an area that we have to exploit. And this is an area that if we want to win this game, we're going to have to get a lot of production in this matchup.
Yeah, I think, I watched that whole Georgia Tech game. I think it was one of the best college football games of the season that went to, I forget, 6, 7, 8 overtimes. And both teams were so god darn tired. Georgia Tech had won that game. And then the SEC refs in Athens said, I'd rather this one go to overtime. And there were like 6 straight questionable calls in the fourth quarter. They got Georgia back into it. And then neither team could convert a 2-point conversion. So you had all of this successful running, all of this successful short yardage situations, and then neither team could run the football because they were just so, I think, gal darn tired. But by the end of that game, but Georgia Tech and Alabama with Jalen Milroe and Georgia Tech with Haynes King put on film how a running quarterback can expose the Georgia defense. And I think all year we have situationally deployed Riley Leonard's legs. Like, if we get a big lead, we are not going to go run him 15, 20 times a game. We've been very judicious which games he's going to go run the ball 15 times and which games he's going to run the ball 5 or 6 times. If we are truly in RPO mode with Riley Leonard and Jeremiah Love, Jadarian Price at running back, I think there's on tape 2 examples that Kirby Smart is going to have a different answer. And they did not have it figured out against Georgia Tech. And everyone knew what Georgia Tech was doing. Like, that's been their offense all year. It's not like Georgia Tech showed something that wasn't on film. And it's a very, very similar offense to Notre Dame. So I think there's parts of our defense where I'm just like, gosh, I think we can make them one dimensional. And it's a really favorable matchup, just letting our coverage secondary shut down the, now rookie QB and Gunnar Stockton and just focus in on that run game. And can we hold up despite the Riley Mills injury? Like, I think that's a really good matchup for Notre Dame. On the secondary, on the other side of the ball, I think it's a favorable matchup for Notre Dame to go run the ball against Georgia. I think you're exactly right. I don't think we're going to go take advantage of their secondary. I think their secondary is gettable, but I don't think we're going to be able to be the ones to take advantage of them. Certainly, if Texas couldn't do it, I don't think we're the team that's going to be able to take advantage. But I do think we are an even better version of, say, what a Georgia Tech tries to do, or an even better version of what Alabama tries to do with Jalen Milroe's mobility. I get really excited about that matchup for Notre Dame. That's a great transition to score predictions. So ESPN has Notre Dame winning this 54% of the time. The ESPN Gunkulator, the FPI win predicting machine that they spit out, has Notre Dame as a slight favorite. Vegas opened up as a 1.5 point favorite, and that is since as a 1.5 point underdog. That has since moved to Georgia being a 2 point favorite. And then SP Plus, it's an impeccable matchup as far as it comes to SP Plus. Notre Dame has the number 4 offense in SP Plus going against Georgia's number 10 defense. Notre Dame has the number 4 defense going up against Georgia's number 5 offense. All of that put together, we talked earlier about special teams as a 3 point advantage. Overall, SP Plus implies Georgia should be about a half point favorite. All of this, suffice to say, it's a coin flip. Like every model you look at, if you're talking about, 0 to 3 point margins either way or 54%, this is a coin flip. This is a 50-50 game. It should be an awesome matchup in New Orleans. I didn't even mention this yet on the show, by the way. Ann and I are driving down on Monday to New Orleans to go to the game. We're actually sitting not with Mike, but Mike with your brother and dad. So we're really excited to go to the game with them and some of our other friends. So with all of that lead up, not that that matters for score predictions, although I guess you could argue with me in the stadium, the Notre Dame fan base is bound to be louder than the Dogs. But Mike, what do you got for a score prediction?
Yeah, so I think this is going to be relatively low scoring. I mentioned this before. Stockton, he played okay in emergency action in the SEC championship. He kind of gave them an initial jolt of energy, got them that got them that touchdown. But then Texas did seem to figure it out. So I think I expect him to be solid. I think with some time for Georgia to figure out how to incorporate him into the offense, I think he'll play okay. I think it's a drop off though from Carson Beck, and I think our secondary will be able to keep them in check. I think their passing offense certainly takes a step back. And I expect them to react more to pressure than Carson Beck did. And as we mentioned, Carson Beck threw a number of interceptions, so I wouldn't be surprised to see him make a couple critical mistakes. He made one against Texas, and kind of with that, I also expect to see Al Golden's best in terms of exotic pressures and blitzes. If there was a time to really open up the playbook, not to say that he hasn't this year, I think this is the game to do that. So I think when you look at keeping their passing game in check, they take a step back. That might cause them to lean on their run game a little bit more. But as we've seen for many times this year from our defense, when we make teams one dimensional, which I think we'll be able to here, Al Golden has been able to shut them down. Even if the run game is healthier than it's been all year, I think this is an area that if we can make them one dimensional, we have a pretty good idea of what they're going to try to do. I think we can kind of snuff out what they're trying to do. On offense, for the Notre Dame offense, this is a pretty big test for us. We've faced a few good defenses, and this is another good one. Top 10, as you mentioned, Brett. Georgia, they've been spotty a few times this year. And we called out there are a few areas that we can exploit, run defense in particular. I wish the secondary was something that we could exploit, but as we mentioned, because we are not built to exploit the secondary, we have the advantage of not making their pass rush is disruptive to us. Kind of funny how that works out. But I expect I expect overall to see the best version of Georgia's defense. You mentioned Kirby Smart, give him a couple weeks to prepare. He's really hard to beat in those scenarios. I think these weaknesses that they have, I think they're going to be a little bit more polished at addressing them than we've seen in the past. So, look, I don't think it's going to be the number one Georgia defenses of old that we've seen in the past few years, but I expect them to look a little bit closer to that level. So I think we're still going to be able to exploit those matchups to our advantage a little bit, but we're not going to be just running the ball down their throat. I think we'll be able to get a few big runs, something similar to what we saw against IU. Maybe Jeremiah Love breaks off a big run here or there. But I think both are dealing with injuries. Both teams are built to contend. Both teams are built to slow down the other. I think this is going to be a dogfight, and it's going to come down to a few big plays. I think just tying this all together, week in, week out, we've been saying this is ND's best shot in decades to contend. I think if you're not a fan of the Irish and you're not picking them here, it's time to take that fatalism to another program like the Chicago Bears or the Jets. I have the Irish winning 19-16, as I mentioned, low scoring dogfight. It'll be neck and neck, but we finally take that next big step and beat the elite college football program of the last I guess really since Kirby Smart has taken over, and advance in the postseason. And I'm also deliberately picking a score that is hard to achieve to make Brett's head hurt a little bit more.
I'm gonna say, how do you even get to 19-16? I guess that maybe means we missed 2 extra points. Is that the easiest way to get there?
The goal was to get you thinking about that. So yeah,
Okay.
I there aren't.
It'd
It's
be
a difficult.
four field goals and a touchdown, easy.
Yeah, you could also there's some scenarios here where you could get a safety. I think if you have
Okay.
any combination of safeties, that could be fun too. But yeah, not the easiest score to get to, but that's what I have the Irish winning by 3.
So I'm in a really similar spot. I went back and forth on where I thought this score prediction would land, and I would start by saying I could see a lot of different things happening in this game. It would not surprise me if Kirby Smart has had 3 4 weeks to prepare for this game, has had time to install whatever he's going to install with Gunnar Stockton, time to figure out whatever he wants to do with Jeremiah Love, and they come out and we get blown out. It wouldn't surprise me. There's a reason why every single one of the opening round games was a blowout. I think college football playoff with more time to prepare for certain teams gives big advantages for teams that figure out the wrinkles, figure out adjustments. If you also said we came out and Al Golden just feasted on Gunnar Stockton and Georgia got nothing going. Georgia's had 3 or 4 games this year with multiple turnovers, and the other team just couldn't take advantage. Like, Georgia should have never beaten Kentucky this year, the way Kentucky just dominated Georgia defensively. But Kentucky's offense just couldn't do anything with it. Mike Denbrock, you give him a short field, Mike Denbrock will go and get you points if Al Golden gives him the ball. And so I could see that go both ways. I don't think that's likely to happen. But I do think it's good for Notre Dame fans and college football fans more broadly to remind ourselves there are blowouts in playoffs. There are just as many blowouts in playoffs and teams figuring out how to take advantage of mismatches. It happens at the pro level. There's been massive blowouts in Super Bowls. Like, it's a part of the game of football when teams get very focused in on a mismatch and just keep taking advantage of it. And I could easily see narratives for that to happen here in this game. But if I just step back to what I think are the two biggest headlines, it is the injuries. That's the first headline. The injuries are massive in this game. Notre Dame in quantity and Georgia in Carson Beck. And we have a formula that I stick to all the time for big playoff games, and it's about elite quarterback and wide receiver play and the defenses that can shut them down. And I don't necessarily think Riley Leonard's a top 5, top 10 quarterback. I do think he's a top 25 quarterback. I think that Carson Beck injury now of Georgia not having a true, legit generational elite quarterback in Carson Beck, despite not playing at his best this year, but I think more because of the lack of weapons around him than Carson Beck. I think that is the biggest headline in this game, way more than Riley Mills, and gives Al Golden that chance to feast on a one-dimensional offense that we've talked about so much this year. That Al Golden has so much success when it's one-dimensional. You talked about it too, Mike, that I think that is massive, unless if Gunnar Stockton's the X factor. Like, we don't have any data to suggest that. We don't, he's never started a game. He has one half against Texas and really struggled in there. So sure, if Gunnar Stockton came out and balled out, would I be surprised? No, he's a 4-star quarterback. Am I predicting that? No, I think Gunnar Stockton's going to be in for a long day against Notre Dame's defense, and I think they're going to have to really grind out points. And then on the other hand, and then I think the second big storyline that we always talk about is SP Plus, and this is razor thin. But Notre Dame's got the slightly better offense at number 4 versus Georgia at number 5. And we have the better defense at number 4 versus Georgia at number 10. So when Notre Dame walks out onto that football field on every single play that is not special teams, we will be the slightly better team according to the advanced metrics. We have never been in that situation in these big games. We've always been the 2-touchdown underdog. Now, we aren't just the underdog. Like, we are truly toe to toe with the Georgia Bulldogs on both offense and defense. We have fewer weaknesses than they do outside of special teams. And so I think that just gives Notre Dame the edge. And again, I could see the game going a bunch of ways. I think more often than not, it stays close. And I think more often than not, Notre Dame wins this game. I got the Irish 24-17, all-time classic, late touchdown. Like, I think it's going to be a grinded out, low-scoring game. I'm right there with you. And I give the edge to Notre Dame and Jeremiah Love breaking one late.
Love it. Yeah, this is as you mentioned, Brad, this is really the only time we've had a matchup like this against the one of the premier teams in college football, and we can go in feeling like we're truly there at their same level. And in this case, as the stats would say, maybe even better, play in, play out. So I think it's a credit to Marcus Freeman. It's a credit to the program to just tell you how far we've come. I mean, every other time we've been in a big playoff game like this, we've always been big underdogs. Usually multiple touchdowns. If it was a team like Alabama, basically we would be happy if we kept the score within 10. And this, I like, the expectation is if we don't win, I'll be disappointed. And that's that's not a situation we've been in. There really is no moral victory in this game. It's really just I want to advance, and if we advance, then we have a legitimate shot at winning a title. Certainly, if you beat Georgia, there's no question that you have a team that's capable of winning a title. Look, maybe it's not likely because you still got to beat two other really good teams, but it's something that this team would be capable of doing. So, yeah, I think. And then even just from like a PR standpoint, not that you want to dwell on that too much, but like what a statement would that be to be able to beat the top SEC program? For Notre Dame haters, this would be, I mean, this would be like DEF CON. What is it? One is usually the worst one. I guess us winning a title would be the worst scenario, but this would probably be like DEF CON 2 for them if we beat like an elite SEC program. So yeah, I like the optimism. I think Brett and I are both, look, if you're not picking Notre Dame in this scenario, like when are you going to pick Notre Dame? This is the time to believe in the team and think that they're going to finally get over the hump, because I would say the analysis that we've done, the advanced statistics, it all suggests that they're more than capable of doing so.
Certainly a coin flip, and the luck of the Irish at some point has to flip the coin in our favor. So
It's worth a
I'm
touchdown.
gonna so excited, worth the touchdowns. I'm so excited to be down in New Orleans. What an awesome city! What an awesome college football town. We will, when Notre Dame wins, we will not be at the Orange Bowl, but we will be hosting whoever wants to come to Atlanta for the national championship. Should Notre Dame get that far, we will host any and all Irish Nation listeners for a tailgate, for a beer, for a coffee, for whatever suits you. We're excited about this stretch run, but first things first, got to take care of business on New Year's Day. So Merry Christmas to all, a Happy New Year, and a Irish win. Irish beat dogs.
Irish beat dogs.